We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The Space Race by Ben Perry and Pat.
The space race officially began in late 1954. However, the origins and motives for the space race are rooted deep within history, dating back to World War II and subsequently the Cold War.
With both the United States and the Soviet Union being deemed victors after the Second World War, each nation saw a steady incline in nationalism. A byproduct of this increased nationalism, coupled with the rapid industrialization of the mid-20th century, caused the U.S. and the USSR to both seek supremacy over all other nations. Following the Allied victory in World War II, the USSR began to expand into Western Europe and spread communist ideology. In an effort to prevent the spread of communism, the Cold War broke out between the U.S. and the USSR. The Cold War was a fight between capitalist America and the communist Soviet Union. In its simplest terms, the space race was a contest to see which political economic system, communism or capitalism, could achieve more success in space, and thus which system was more overarchingly successful. The nonviolence of the Cold War called for a compensatory need for the opposing nations to prove their superiority. In order to do so, the U.S. and the USSR sought to exceed the other nation in many regards, mainly through technological and militaristic advances. At the time, the mentality from each nation was that if their country appeared more powerful, then their respective political economic system was correspondingly superior. The space race coexisted with the arms race for nuclear power. The space race, however, emerged as the pinnacle for technological and militaristic power and excellence. This is because space, at the time, was uncharted and largely undocumented territory. The mere premise of reaching space in the mid-19th century seemed unrealistic to many. The Cold War was founded upon the idea of each nation constantly one-upping the other. When the Soviet Union caught wind that the U.S. had created an atomic bomb, they created an atomic bomb. As a result, when the goal of reaching space emerged during the Cold War, a competitive battlefield that took place in the realm of uncharted territory, each nation needed to reach the space before the other.
During 1957 and 1958, both the USSR and the US announced plans to launch satellites into space. However, the United States was still working on a launch vehicle. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by announcing it had successfully placed a satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit. Months later, on November 3, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2, carrying a dog named Laika. This was a major milestone as Laika was the first living being to enter space. The United States' first attempt was called the Vanguard. The launch took place on December 6, 1957. However, the launch failed as the rocket rose 4 feet and crashed back to the launch pad. Finally, on January 31, 1958, the United States launched its first satellite, Explorer 1.
The early Soviet successes in space dealt a blow to American pride and confidence. Previously, the U.S. preferred to concentrate on weapon development. In fact, with the Eisenhower administration focusing on the nation's budget balance, many scientific projects had their fundings cut. The launch of Sputnik, however, was a wake-up call to America. They now understood that they needed to hurry, and that the USSR was pulling ahead in the space race. Americans feared that the world would see the Soviet communist system as superior, and many questioned whether the free and open capitalist system of 1950s America was dominant as they thought. As a result, the U.S. space program, which was previously a concern only among scientists and engineers, was suddenly important to most of the American people. In addition, military experts took the satellite launch as proof that the Soviet Union was probably ahead in ballistic missile development. The feeling was that if the Russians could get a satellite into space, they could probably land a warhead on American soil as well. This pressure forced U.S. officials to put together a space program in an attempt to bolster national pride and international prestige, as well as compete with the Soviets' technological advancements. In 1958, President Eisenhower established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to oversee the space program and make sure the United States caught up to the Soviet Union.
After Yuri Gagarin of the USSR became the first man to enter space in April of 1961, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress and challenged the United States to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. In 1963, the United States successfully sent 2 astronauts into orbit. In the year 1965, the first 2 spacewalks were performed, the first by Alexei Leonov, who spends almost 12 minutes outside the Voskhod spacecraft, and the second by Ed White of the United States. In 1966, The first satellites are put into orbit and the first spacecraft make a successful soft landing on the moon, both projects done in America. In 1967, both the US and the USSR suffered casualties during their attempted expeditions. For the US, fire broke out in the Apollo 1 during a launch test, killing all 3 astronauts aboard. For the USSR, Vladimir Komarov's parachute malfunctioned upon his return to Earth and he was killed. Years later, on July 16, 1969, the United States sent Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins into space aboard the Apollo 11 in an attempt to land on the moon. 4 days later, JFK's challenge was completed as Neil Armstrong took the first steps on the moon, uttering the now renowned line, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Why did the Soviets lose the moon race? Beginning with Sputnik 1, the Soviets were the first to many things. First human in space, first spacewalk, first soft landing on the moon, and the first lunar rover. If the Soviets were first to all that, why didn't they land a man on the moon and win the race? One of the reasons was because the Soviets joined the race late. The Soviets only approved a plan to send a man to the moon 3 years after Kennedy announced the US would go to the moon. However, the Soviets were too late, as NASA had already launched the Saturn I rocket, showing that they were ahead in the game. This late start was not the only problem, because the Soviet defense industry was a chaotic management system. NASA was a government-run program, while the Soviet space program acted more like a socialist version of a competitive market. We can think of this like Tesla nowadays. This organizational chaos plagued the lunar plan early on, as the Soviets were unable to collaborate by themselves to organize a lunar mission. As a result, many proposed missions to launch cosmonauts were canceled. Another Soviet issue was a lack of money. With the Cold War occurring, the Soviets invested much of their funds into the arms race, especially into their ICBMs and nuclear weapons manufacturing, to keep up with the United States. Due to this excess funding, the USSR didn't have as much money to spend on the space race, while the US did. A combination of the 3 previous factors, along with numerous other reasons, caused the Soviet Union to lose the space race, and when Apollo 11 was launched, the race was over.
As the space race came to an end and the United States claimed victory in 1969 by placing the first man on the moon, as we alluded to before, the hostility of the Cold War slowly began to dissipate. In 1971, détente began. One of the reasons for détente occurring was the United States' victory in the space race, which was a major win for capitalism. In fact, when the United States won the space race, they won a major victory in the Cold War. Because the US won, capitalism concurrently won. As a result, the popularity and notoriety of capitalism skyrocketed, and communism saw a major hit in popularity. In 1972, a major détente milestone occurred when the US and the USSR combined forces and collaborated on space exploration while upon the newly formed International Space Station. Even today, the US and the USSR, along with many other countries, continue to collaborate on space exploration. Due to the space race, hostility between the United States and the USSR declined, capitalism triumphed over communism, and collaboration soon commenced between the US and the USSR.